Welcome to the February 21st, 2023 regular City Council meeting. We'll begin with the roll call.
Councilmember Burkover, Councilmember Garcia.
Here.
Councilmember Watson.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Gregg.
Here.
Mayor Bacon.
Present. And I'll make a motion to excuse Councilperson Burkover's absent. Look for a second.
I second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next, I'll look for approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
I was in favor, sorry. I was late.
Motion carries. Next up, approval of the minutes, regular City Council meeting, February 7th, 2023. I'll look for a motion.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Moved. I'll second. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Got to give you some more time, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thanks.
All written communication received by council are posted to the online agenda packet. That's all communication received before 4 p.m. Next up, we'll have communication from the audience. You have 5 minutes, either before or after. Please fill out one of the blue slips if you'd like to speak to council. And just step up to the podium. Seeing none, is there anyone in the online queue?
There are no callers in the queue.
All right, thank you. Next up, communication from mayor and council members. Councilperson Garcia.
Yes, Mayor, I have a couple items. Monday, February 13th, our community was devastated. Our community, our family, lost 3 wonderful, bright young people to violence. 5 more young people fight for their lives today. We have seen over the past week that although our community was shaken, we refuse to be broken. The support and love of this community has been phenomenal, to say the least. At this time, I'd like to take this time to recognize a police force who, when it really counted, exposed who they really are. As people ran from terror and fear, over 100 police officers from multiple area agencies led from their heart, running towards the danger with bravery. I, like many, listened to the scanner while the events unfolded. I was impressed with the professionalism of all the officers that responded, and they came from everywhere. I even heard an officer come as far as Williamston, and I'm sure there was even further. The show of force was remarkable, and that show of force saved lives. We know the suspect in this case was armed with the intent for many more casualties. However, his plan was disrupted by an overwhelming amount of police presence. Among those many fearless officers that responded, our very own East Lansing Police Department was among them. I'd like to take this time to read the names of all officers from our department that responded that Monday night. There was 1 supervisor and 3 officers working that Monday night. We had a total of 35 officers at the scene, starting from Jail Service Officer Softic, Cadets Martin and Cadet Lemire, Pace Officer Rochester, Pace Officer Barber, Officer Horn, Canine Officer Horn, Officer Woodruff, Officer Menzer, Officer DeBeer, Officer Whalen, Officer Jones, Officer Nelson, Officer Hamilton, Detective Mommerstieg, Detective Horst, Officer Shattuck, Detective Cotton, Officer Smith, Officer Wright, Officer Harrison, Officer Kingsbury, Canine Officer Cassidy, Officer Benson, Officer Vieira, Chaplain Gale. We had our leadership there as well. Sergeant Mitchell, Sergeant Fuller, Sergeant Steeman, Sergeant Young, Lieutenant Sexton, Lieutenant Park, Lieutenant O'Hara, Captain Pride, Deputy Chief Connolly, and the CEO, Chief Johnson. Again, East Lansing Police Department has 43 sworn officers, 35 responded. So basically, all those that were able responded, and over 60% of those officers responded without being called back. They responded on their own while off duty. Captain Pride, I see you back there. I think I can say without hesitation, on behalf of the citizens of this city, please send our gratitude to your brave officers. I have one more thing. I'm going to change gears here and talk about history that has been made at East Lansing High School in the sports. East Lansing wrestling team made history this last week. Eli actually wrote a great story about the growing wrestling program at East Lansing High School to the credit of five-year coach Tom Woodward. Just to give you a little history here about the wrestling program, started off, East Lansing High School wasn't a very big wrestling program. 3 years ago, the wrestling team had 5 wrestlers. Last year, when my son started wrestling as a freshman, Coach Woodward had grown the program to 17 wrestlers. This year, the program grew to 33 wrestlers, 3 or 4 female, 4 female wrestlers. In his 5 years of coaching, Coach Woodward has led 4 state qualifiers, 4 wrestlers to state qualifier. So let me get to the history part. We're proud that this year East Lansing High School has its very first female state qualifier. First-year freshman, Maya Terranova. Maya, stand up. Awesome. Awesome. She will be competing at state competition on the weekend of March 3rd and 4th at Ford Field. Love to see Trojans out there supporting. So congratulations to Maya and her family, Bernadette and Rob, and her brother, Julian, who's also a wrestler. Junior, right, Julian? And your young sister, Sloan, is here as well. Congratulations, Terranovas. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And definitely congratulations to the wrestlers. And I'll say when I was coaching football, I'd try to make everyone come out for wrestling because I thought it'd make you a better football player. So I know you guys are amazing athletes, and it's the only sport where you can actually taste your organs when you're competing. So I respect what you guys do. It's awesome. Thank you so much. Councilperson Watson.
It's nice to see all the alums, and congratulations to you, Maya. I have something that I wanted to read. So many feelings and thoughts have been expressed that I echo since Monday, February 13th. This evening, I share a future that we can achieve of no mass shootings in our state and nation. Our Michigan legislature is prepared to act before. Now I see serious gun reform in our near future. Gun laws and policies that statistically show we stopped the carryout of another mass shooting. Sometimes it is easier to blame a group of people or a legislative body. Blame doesn't solve, and it's taken layers of decisions, actions, and unaddressed problems to live in a nation like this. We didn't have mass shootings when I grew up. Duck and cover drills stopped by the 80s because we significantly reduced the threat of a nuclear attack. We can do that again. So hold us all accountable. Ask and demand, join and pray, love, and I wish us healing. And finally, I wish us peace and problem solving without gun use. We need help and the people to acknowledge it and open our minds to a different state of living in this city, state, and in this nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem?
I wish that I had had the presence of mind to prepare a written statement so that I didn't stumble through this awkwardly, but I'm going to stumble through this awkwardly. Or maybe not, sorry. I guess I'm gonna let my inarticulate silence speak for itself. I thought that I had passed this part of my grieving, but apparently I have not. So I'm going to let Mr. Bacon take public comment, and you'll just have to feel my feelings with me.
Yeah, and I'll pick it up from there. I feel my feelings deeply along these same lines. I have had to play many roles this week, very difficult. I can only physically, I can only compare the losses this week to perhaps losing my parents. That's how closely it felt inside of my body. That's how it felt emotionally and otherwise. I do want to take the time to first acknowledge and thank, really at this point, every member of our staff in the city of East Lansing, and simultaneously kind of welcome into this crisis. We were welcoming interim city manager Randy Telefero as he's coming into the city and getting off of an airplane, and this crisis is beginning. You know, sometimes right person, wrong time type of thing. I couldn't have felt much more secure with someone that I know how they respond in crisis than him. I got the area that I was in with Chad Pride and Chief and other members inside the police station, feeling rather helpless. I consider myself a pretty calm individual in my demeanor and how I approach things, but I really want to appreciate their leadership, particularly from Chief and Chad inside of that operating center, and making sure not only that we stopped the assailant, but that everyone got home alive from that situation, which is an understated point in this right now. I do think the swift action and bravery prevented further loss of life. I also think preparation from our other apparatuses in public safety, particularly fire and EMS, saved lives, and their fearless entering into situations that weren't yet necessarily secure. We're hoping for the recovery of the individuals who were injured. I know that swift engagement with those individuals potentially saved their lives as well. So there's no doubt about it. And then beyond that, to this point, I want to thank really all the staff, particularly everyone here at the Hannah Center. And we really have a long road ahead, but the swift engagement to talk with people and get people talking and into counseling, and just making space here, the library, kind of anywhere where there's space, we've made space for people to gather, talk, and just kind of be. That's what I think is in the most important part this week. I met with parents of at least one of the victims this week. Probably one of the more difficult interactions I've ever had to have, and it will stick with me for a very long time. And their faces, their loss is kind of indescribable. But ultimately, we will find a path forward. We will reclaim the space, and we will do the work necessary to feel safe again. Yeah, I think I've had so many comments, I'm almost out of words. But just know that everyone involved as a community, this has been one of the greatest outpourings, both locally and nationally, that I've really ever seen. And I appreciate it from far and wide. I've had people reach out from everywhere to thank East Lansing, and many of even my coworkers and people outside of here had children there that day, or people who had just left the union, or any of those types of things. So they were appreciative of the life-saving actions of that day. So it stretches far beyond the reaches of the city, the entire state, nation, internationally, like what Councilperson Garcia said. This was an international action, and I've always said that kind of when things occur here, and that's kind of my approach to it. I've always considered us a small town, but we're big, and the impact is big, and even this response was big. So just know that, continue to stick together. This is going to be a long road. Many of the people that initial burst, anyone who's suffered loss, you know that initial time after the loss, there's a lot of help and a lot of things and more food than you can possibly eat and all those things. But the grief and the time past that is when we as a community are going to have to kind of redouble our efforts and come back for the individuals who haven't even yet begun to grieve. So that's our commitment. We'll be here until, and we continue to stand with those, and my prayers go out to the individuals who are still trying to heal, and just an acknowledgement. Sometimes they're the lost people in these things. People forget what's next for that long road to recovery, even beyond healing, for the individuals who were injured in these types of incidents. So my thoughts and prayers go out to the parents. I have the exact same fear. I've talked to my kids who don't live at home every single day this week, and we don't talk every single day, but I make up something to talk about every single day right now. So I'm with you, and we'll stick together, and we'll be here for the after of this. And if it doesn't come to you for weeks or months, we'll still be here to listen. So that's where we'll go from there. Next up, City Manager's report.
Thank you, Mayor. I also have a prepared statement. I'll start with, first and most importantly, our hearts go out to the victims, the Michigan State University community, the East Lansing community, and the Greater Lansing community. As we continue to navigate the tragic event and mass shooting that took place on the campus of Michigan State last Monday, we are especially saddened for the families of Ariel Anderson, Alexandria Al Verner, and Brian Fraser. There are no words that can express our genuine sorrow for their loss. This horrendous incident will have a lasting and forever impact on each and every one of us. I want to acknowledge and thank the first responders for their actions on that evening. Our police officers, firefighters, and paramedics reminded us that they are true, selfless heroes in moments like this. They did the things they were trained to do without reservation. They have a very demanding job that requires them to be at their best always. It is a standard that is very hard to live up to, but it is a standard that we expect nevertheless. This sometimes causes conflict, and we understand that. But on nights like this, we are so thankful to have you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. To our families and to your families, the responders' families, we also say thank you. We know that you have your own concerns and fears in moments like this, and we appreciate the sacrifices that you must make also. And before I go past that, I'd just like to especially acknowledge Captain Pride. That morning, he lost his father, and he was there that evening working throughout that event because of the need. And so when you talk about dedication, I think there's no better example of that, to the dedication that many of our responders have to the job. Deputy Chief Mark Kunter, who was the fire incident commander, his son was in a very, very serious car accident on the next day. And so while they're dealing with the emotional trauma of this event and events like this, there are also people dealing with their own issues, their own emergencies, and I don't want to lose sight of that as we move past this. I'd like to also acknowledge the extraordinary work done by our Parks and Works, our Parks and Recreation Department, our library group, and our communication staffs during this difficult time. All of our staff stepped up in so many ways, working with the Michigan State University staff to try to meet the needs of our students, our staff, and our community. Everyone has been responsive, making every effort to address the concerns as they arise, and remain adaptive during issues like this. And so we want to say thank you to the entire staff at the City of East Lansing, and especially those work groups that I know carried a yeoman's load during this event. Finally, to the members of City Council, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to working with each and every one of you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I hope I can live up to your expectations and those of the community. I have asked that one-on-one meetings be set up and scheduled with each of you, and feel free to reach out to me at any time if I can be of assistance. I'm sure that I will have more to report in the future, but obviously this week has been a whirlwind, and I don't think you could write a script that would have written anything like this to just arrive at that time and during that incident. I will say I was extremely proud of what I heard over the scanners and what I was able to observe through talking with those that were in the emergency operations centers. There was really a tremendous amount of cooperation and courage exemplified that night, and again, I just say thank you, and that will conclude my report.
Thank you. City Attorney's report.
Sure. Yeah, good evening, everyone. I would certainly echo the sentiments of everything that's been said tonight, and it's really been amazing to watch the city employees and the things that they've done to help the community in the aftermath. With that being said, I don't have a report, and I'm always happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Next up, the consent agenda.
Okay, we have a special presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I jump right over it? Item 3. I'm sorry about that. Item 3.1, presentation of general fund 5-year financial forecast.
Hi, good evening. Let me formally introduce myself to our new council member. I'm Audrey Kincaid, Acting Finance Director. I have Justin Geiger with me. He's going to help run the presentation. And then we'll have our city assessor, Dave Lee, come up in a little bit to talk about some assessing particulars. All right, so we're up and running. So this is kind of our unofficial kickoff to the budget season. However, we, meaning finance and all city departments, have already been working on our year-end estimates and budget requests for more than 2 months now. So what we've been working on are putting together our fiscal year 23 estimates for our revenue and expense numbers for this forecast. And then our personnel costs are coming from fiscal year 24 position budgeting requests. So I'm going to run through the layout of the document, and then I will focus our attention on the actual forecast. So what are we looking at today? We're just looking at the general fund, as it's the main operating fund of the city. We're not looking at income tax, but there's a lot of components of the income tax fund that hit the general fund, but we're not looking at the full scope of the income tax fund. And we're also not looking at the breadth of ARPA spending. We have some recommendations included in here, but there are many recommendations yet to come. So I will ask for your forgiveness, as I'm still kind of catching up as the acting finance director. So I've really relied heavily on my finance staff and staff all across the city to help come up with these forecast numbers. So I might not be able to answer all your questions off the cuff like Jill was able to, but we'll put together some Q&A and provide those to council if we're not able to answer something tonight. And then, of course, I'm going to heavily rely on my notes because there's a lot of details to cover tonight. So if you have a question, just kind of like try and catch somebody's attention, and I'll pause, and we can go from there. So running through the document itself, on pages 2 through 4, we have our risks and uncertainties. And these are highlighting items that have kind of a macro impact on the forecast as a whole. So they're for items that have significant risk, and they're quite complex and volatile. So we've had to make a lot of assumptions on these kind of global items. Noteworthy items on pages 5 through 7 are speaking specifically to certain line items, and they're specifically noted noteworthy things. So I'm going to probably highlight all of those things as I go through the line item detail of the forecast. Pages 8 through 10 are the specific assumptions that we've used for each of those line items for the forecast. So if we've used a particular percentage for CPI or another basis for the outer years, it's listed in revenues and expense assumptions on those pages. Then the large page document, that's the forecast on page 11. That's where we're going to spend most of our time tonight. And we'll go, like I said, go through line item details of all of those items. The assessing information that we're going to talk through is on pages 12 through 15. It shows taxable values, which our assessor is going to go over, and then it has some historical information and projections for the next 5 years. Then the last 4 pages, pages 16 through 19, show more detailed components of all the line items in the forecast. So if you're, for example, looking for the details of the income tax transfer, you can look on page 15 and see how much is covering lost property tax revenue and how much is from the public safety allocation. Or operating expenditures, we only have one line item on the forecast, but it's made up of several different items that you'll see on that very last page. So what I'm going to do, what I find is helpful, is taking that legal size document and those last 4 pages and kind of walking through each of those line items. And if you want more specific details on what's in those line items, you can kind of see those together as we go. All right, so let's switch to the actual forecast itself and go through the layout of this document. So each column, okay, so we're looking at fiscal year 22 actual revenues, then we have the 23 budget and what we think our expectations are going to be for 23, and then we've got fiscal year 24 forecast out through fiscal year 28 for each column. Each column also has a percentage comparison to the prior fiscal year. Both fiscal year 23 budget and expectation are compared to 23 actuals, so that's the only one that kind of compares to the same thing. The top section we're covering revenue items. Then those are combined with prior year fund balance to give us our total resources for the general fund. The bottom section are expenditures, which net against the revenues above to show an accumulation or use of fund balance, which is highlighted in yellow. And then that carries down to our total fund balance, which is denoted in purple. And then that'll flow to the next year column for beginning fund balance. Below total fund balance, there are a few items that are designated for specific purposes, and so those reduce total fund balance to get us to available fund balance. And at the very bottom, I've provided a couple operating indicators that are commonly used, and I'll discuss the details of those at the end. And so not to give the full story away, but this is it is the most positive forecast that I've seen it with my time at the city. I tried to be conservative, we're new at this as well. There are some very positive things in here that I'm very comfortable with. There are some other items that are at risk, and we'll kind of talk through those and we'll see how those kind of shake out for the overall story. Are there any questions on the layout or the document itself before we go on to the details? Okay. So then the first line item is property taxes, and I'm going to kind of turn it over to Dave Lee since his work is what drives those property tax numbers.
Good evening. I haven't met all of you, so I'll just introduce myself. I'm Dave Lee. I'm the assessor, the city assessor Freeze Lansing. And as Audrey mentioned, my piece in this puzzle is to project taxable value growth and the tax base for property taxes for the next 5 years. So pages 12 through 15, I'm going to go over with you specifically, but before I get into that with you, I should caution you a couple things. So we never want to overstate our estimate of revenue, right? We don't want to be in a position where we're overstated revenue for budgeting purposes. So everything that I've done is conservative, okay? It might be a little bit on the low side, but we try to be careful with that. I should also point out that we only forecast for the general fund. So if there is a large development project in a capture district like the DDA or a brownfield, that won't be included in my projections because the city won't see that in the near term. It won't see any tax growth from those projects in the near term. We also focus only on residential and commercial property, real property. The city has a very small industrial tax base. It's not material for these budget projections. So what we do is we look at the growth in, or projected growth in commercial property and residential property. We also don't pay any attention to, for these projections, we don't pay any attention to personal property. So property that's owned by businesses like computers, office equipment and so forth. We don't include that in the projections because that's not predictable from one year to the next. It's highly unpredictable. And so there's just not a good way to put that into these projections. I can say with all that said that the real estate market is very strong, and probably everyone knows that. It's been strong over the last couple of years. I'll just give you, for instance, the residential parcels on average in the Ingham County portion of the city, it was more than a 9.5% increase on average for them this year to keep assessments at 50% of market level. So that's a huge increase in terms of growth in the tax base. The other thing to keep in mind as we go through this is that for property taxes, you have a taxable value and you have an assessed value. Taxable value growth is limited by the rate of inflation each year. And this year, for the first year, the rate of inflation was set at 5% by the state, which is the maximum that it can be. So that results in increased tax base and also then increased revenue for the city. So I guess with that said, let me walk through my portion of the 5-year forecast. On page 12, you've got a kind of a history. This is kind of background information. It's a history of assessed or state equalized value and taxable value from 2010 till present, along with percentage increases or changes from one year to the next, inflation rate multipliers for those years. And kind of note on this page is that the ratio of taxable value to state equalized value there's still a gap between assessed and taxable value, which means that when a property is assessed and taxable value, when a property sells and its taxable value is uncapped, there's going to be a larger percentage increase for a lot of properties. Okay, so with that said, let me push on to page 13. So we look at the forecast in terms of, we break it down in two ways. We look at what the projected increase in tax base will be for existing property. So property that's already in existence, there are market changes for those properties, and what is projected for the tax base growth for that set of properties. And so for this page kind of runs through that for the next fiscal year and the 5 fiscal years into the future. And you can see we've got projected a 5% increase for residential parcels in the city and a 4% increase for commercial parcels in the city for this upcoming fiscal year. And then for the next fiscal year, we've decreased that to 3% and 2% for residential and commercial properties respectively. We anticipate that there will still be some inflationary and strong inflationary factors and strong market growth over the next year or so, but again, it's a little bit farther out in the future and we want to be conservative. And so the years after that, we've also included a 1.5% increase for both classes of property for the future years. So the other way that we look at that, in addition to what the tax base is going to grow from existing property, we look at known or highly likely projects that are in development or are being completed. for the current year upcoming and for the 5 years out. And so on pages 14 and 15, we've got a list of those projects that are known to us or highly likely. And again, nothing in the DDA, nothing in the capture district, because we won't see that revenue in the general fund in the near term. And that, on page 15 in the middle, those development projects are summarized and totaled. And then at the bottom of that page, we kind of put it all together where we add the growth in existing property to the projects that are listed above to get kind of an estimate for each of the fiscal years in terms of tax base change or growth. So I guess with that said, if anybody has any questions about my piece to the puzzle, I'd be glad to address them. Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Sorry.
Some questions. The 5-year forecast of taxable value, is that everybody on the list?
The list of development projects?
Yeah.
So it's projects that we know are going to happen or are highly likely in our mind, in my mind. I mean, I've been wanting to put this together. In my mind, that is, we don't want to have a project that's not going to happen on that list, right?
Okay.
Because we don't want to overstate revenue. So that's everything that we know about or everything that we think is pretty sure is going to happen.
All right. Did you know that number 13, there's a negative?
Yes, I did know that. So, and that's a good question. And that's, I understand your concern with how could that happen? What happened there is that we had so our status date for property taxes is December 31st of the prior year. So December 31st, 2022, that's however the property sat on that day, that's how it's going to be taxed for 2023, for tax year 2023. And with tax year 2023, the structure that had been on that property to allow the development, it had been demolished. So there was a decrease in value for that property, for that project for 2023. And then in future years, once the development is completed, it'll go back up again. But we want to include pluses as well as minuses, whatever was realistic.
Okay. And do you have the previous 5-year forecast? So that would be, 2023, 5 years ago?
I don't have them with me, but we could certainly provide them to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Questions?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so then back to the forecast document, that top line, property taxes and marijuana taxes, in there, as Dave mentioned, we take his figures and our treasurer, Andrea Smith, uses those numbers to come up with the actual dollars for property tax revenue. So based on his information, using that 5% inflation multiplier plus new developments, that resulted in a 5.9% growth of revenue for fiscal year 24's forecast. And then, as Dave mentioned, fiscal year 25 has about a 3%, and then outer years are 1.5%. Because this line also includes marijuana taxes, the 25 number has a percentage increase of 3.5%, and that's because, so the marijuana taxes are the city's share of excise taxes that are collected by the state of Michigan, and then they're reallocated to communities based on the number of licensed facilities they have in the city. So the city received allocation for 3 facilities in fiscal year 22, and we're expecting to get allocation for 4 facilities for 23 and 24. And then that spike in 25 is because we're expecting a 5th facility that's currently under construction to come online. But because of the state's fiscal year, we wouldn't get that for a couple years. So probably fiscal year 25 at the earliest for that 5th facility. Then moving on to transfers from income tax. This is made up of 2 components: the reimbursement from lower property taxes. So we have that 5% or 5 mil reduction in the property tax mills. So we make the general fund whole first off to make sure that the general fund is not harmed from having the income tax. So that's the first component. And then there's the 20% allocation from public safety. So once we've projected out income tax revenue, we reduce that by admin staff and operating costs. The property tax reimbursement to the general fund, and then we do that remaining split. The balance of that, 60% goes to pension, 20% to infrastructure, and 20% to public safety, which comes directly to the general fund. So the expectations for the income tax fund, we seem to be doing better year after year. Unfortunately, because we have no year with kind of the same parameters, it's been pretty difficult to estimate what those revenues are going to look like. But we are seeing positive, revenue every year. We're continuing to expand our compliance efforts, and we are currently we're following up on state information from the 2019 tax returns. So we've been able to reach out to people that haven't filed, and we're seeing additional revenue come in from that. Fiscal year 23 also includes a little bit of a carryover from fiscal year 22. There was just additional revenue that we didn't have budget allocated for to do the transfer, so we had to hold off and do that transfer in 23. So that is the increase that you're seeing from the budget. Just anecdotally, remote work seems to be having less of an impact on withholdings this year. So, for instance, our 22 withholdings as of January were 12.6 million, and compared to last year for tax year 21, they were only 11.5 million. So it seems that we're doing better on the withholding side. For future years, I assumed a 3% personal growth assumption and then a 20% allowance for refunds to come up with the numbers that I was using as my basis to do these calculations. All right, moving on to state shared revenue. So this is the city's allocation of sales tax collected by the state. We use the published Michigan Economic Outlook to come up with those figures. They estimated a small increase in sales tax collections. However, we recently noticed that the governor is recommending a 10% increase to communities for their revenue sharing component. So we'll just have to kind of see how that all shakes out with the state's budget. But that would be an absolutely great positive trend for the city for that revenue source. PA 289 is our fire protection money from the state. So these are monies to assist with the cost of fire services that are provided to certain tax-exempt buildings within the city, so meaning MSU. It's based on a formula of the value of those properties and actual expenditures of the fire department from the prior year. Historically, we had not been receiving full funding, so it was always subject to state appropriations, and it still is, but it seems that the state is much more committed to fully funding that. So since fiscal year 20, we've actually been fully funded in this area, so we're assuming that we'll still be fully funded out in the outer years, and then we've built in a small percentage increase because, again, those are based on the expenses of the fire department, so we're assuming those expenses are going to go up in the future as well. All right, then we have our other intergovernmental revenue. So these are revenues or cost sharing from other units of government, and primarily it's made up of state reimbursement for our judges' wages and then a small taxpayer loss reimbursement from the state. Fiscal year 22 was the final year of our cost sharing agreement with MSU and Meridian for our dispatch legacy costs. So that's where you're seeing that small dip in fiscal year 23. Then we have our franchise fees. So this includes both the BWL franchise fee and our cable franchise fee from DirecTV and Comcast. So the cable franchise fees has been seeing a sort of decline in the last few years. With all of the streaming services available, the cable franchise fees are declining. We are seeing positive trends on the BWL fees, but that's somewhat of an uncertain revenue source because, as you know, we're going through ongoing litigations and we have an appeal, and that source is not settled and final. And I'm going to talk more about the results of that or the impacts of that at the very end of the forecast. Moving on to licenses and permits. So we have several categories of licenses and permits. So specifically building and engineering permits. There's a slight decline in fiscal year 23 as a couple of large developments are wrapping up. So those permits were collected in prior years as those are are wrapped up. So that's something like MSU FCU downtown and the Etesteo up on West Road. So as those wrap up, we're still assuming that there is going to be building and there's consistent, but those big projects do have kind of a dramatic impact in a single year when we've got those big projects. Housing licenses are remaining pretty much stable. There's a cost recovery permit, so we usually have small rate increases to make sure that we're continuing to cover our costs. And building and restaurant licenses, you'll see a large increase in the 23 expectation compared to 22 actual, and that's because of the postponed due date. We, when they're collected typically in June, we would record that revenue in last fiscal year, but since we postponed that due date, we're probably going to see somewhat like 2 years worth of revenue in 1 year, and then we only had the 1 year, or well, we only had half basically of our license revenue in 22. Moving on to fines and forfeitures. So this is an area where we've seen a lot of decline in revenue over the last few years. We saw a decline prior to COVID, and then COVID kind of really impacted that decline much more significantly. We're seeing a little bit of improvement on the parking fine side as MSU students and all those activities are starting to return to the city. So we're seeing some improvement on those. But for ordinance fines, it's feeling like this is starting to trend like our new normal. We're basically, as I said, we're kind of on a steady decline. At this point, we're about 15% of where we were 10 years ago. So it's feeling like that's, like I said, the new normal on those. So charges for services,
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
So on the business and restaurant licenses?
Yes.
Just liquor licenses, after the first two columns show dashes. Why is that?
So we would be estimating 0 for those, and I'd have to talk with the department on their expectation for 0 for liquor licenses.
Okay.
Okay. So then moving on to charges for services, I would highly recommend looking through those last 4 pages. Like I said, charges for services encompasses a lot of different things and across a lot of different departments. So that would include things such as ambulance charges, court cost recovery fees, shared services with Meridian Township for our building inspectors, and then services provided to MSU specifically by our police and fire departments. And like I said, more detail on that is on set pages 17 and 18. Most of the categories have small increases in future years that align with CPI, but there's a few items that I thought were worth noting. So there's a DDA downtown maintenance service charge, and we're recommending to increase that funding from the DDA to support additional staffing for downtown maintenance. They're still working on the details of that arrangement, but this forecast includes the assumption that they would fund 2 additional positions for downtown maintenance. There's also increased revenue from MSU related to fire services, and this increase is based on some new terms in a recently signed contract with MSU and our fire department. And then fiscal years 23 and fiscal through 25 include a 50% cost share with residents for hazardous sidewalk programs. So the cost would be a $500,000 program shared between the sidewalk revenue charges for services to residents, and then the other half would be funding provided through ARPA. So you'll see those items later in the forecast. So our other revenue line item has kind of a wacky fluctuation in the most recent years, and this is primarily because it includes investment income. It also includes things like our internal building rent charges and our external leases. So when I say interest income fluctuation, you may remember during our 22 audit presentation, we had to recognize significant losses for our investments. So we saw negative investment income in our funds. So we're expecting those losses to reverse on our investments, and then we're also expecting to receive like interest income on all of our accounts. So we're hoping that all reverses for this year, and then outer years are just going to be kind of routine, normal interest income. Another item to highlight is miscellaneous revenue. So in fiscal year '22, this included $120,000, and this is related to the implementation of GASB 87, which is we changed how we record leases. So this was a one-time entry to record all of our existing leases, and an offsetting amount was recorded in expenses under capital outlay. So, like I said, this is a one-time implementation entry to catch us up with the accounting pronouncement. We wouldn't see that large of an entry each year, but if we have a new lease, we would have to do kind of similar accounting for that each time we have a new lease, but it wouldn't be nearly as significant. In that same line item, or same category for miscellaneous revenue, there's also miscellaneous court costs that have kind of fluctuated. And fiscal year '23, we received a one-time settlement from opioid litigation, and that was about $115,000 as a one-time settlement. All the other items are pretty much consistent and not changing much for our estimates. And lastly, for revenue, we've got our grant revenue. So typical things in this account or in this line item are our specialty court grants, CDBG sidewalk grants, and then typically we have various police and fire grants. So the reason for all the fluctuation that we're seeing in the forecast is that from ARPA revenue. So fiscal year '22 includes $300,000 of revenue for hazard pay, and our basement backup prevention program was kicking off. '23 is expected to have $850,000 of ARPA funds. The last little bit of hazard pay for our police and fire, now that their contract is settled, additional basement backup prevention as that program continues, our drain construction project, and our hazardous sidewalk repair project. And then fiscal years '24 and '25 are only including ARPA amounts for hazardous sidewalk. Like I said, a $250,000 per year for the program. We have additional ARPA funds to discuss, and we're gonna work on that as a staff and come up with recommendations and bring some new items to council, hoping soon. So stay tuned. Then the last item that is kind of trailing off is federal grants for the fire department. There was a SAFER grant, which funded the portion of the cost of 4 firefighters, and that is wrapping up this year. And so the specialty court grants and CDBG, we're expecting those to stay constant. We haven't assumed any other changes, but departments are always on the lookout for grant opportunities. So new things come up all the time. So then highlighted in green below that revenue section are the percentage changes that we're expecting in growth for all years. '23 is higher than most years because of that strange investment earnings swing. Again, ARPA revenue and that a small portion of the '22 income tax carryover was impacting that numbers. But the outer years are much more what we're used to seeing in the forecast for revenue growth. So I'm going to throw up a slide for us, a nice representation of revenues. Feel free to ask any questions, but I always like to kind of provide this to show kind of where we're at. And it provides a nice visual representation of that revenue gap that sort of plagued the city since the 2008 recession. So the stacked bar graphs are all the city's general fund revenue categories, and that top line is where our revenues would be with a core inflation factor of 2.25% based on 2007 revenues. And I would say that we're doing better to close that gap. You can kind of see the improvement that we've made. Income tax has been integral in that. But of course, that is set to expire after the 2030 tax year. And then the next slide is basically just that same information in a numerical format if you're a numbers person and if you wanted to dig into the details of what makes up each of those sections of the bar graph. But I feel like it's a nice story to see the general fund revenue historically. So I'm going to pause here for any revenue questions, anything we'd like to go back to, discuss further.
I'm really bad at remembering acronyms.
The fire
but
one?
The fire one.
Yep, 289.
So that's one that traditionally historically has not been fully funded.
It hadn't been up to 2020.
Okay, and are we reasonably sure that that's going to continue to be allocated?
As of now, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, since then
Okay.
we've been fully funded.
Okay,
Yep.
great, thanks.
I have some questions. The marijuana taxes.
Yes.
To my recollection, the revenue isn't accounted for the years to come, or is it accounted for?
It is, yeah. We're assuming 3 facilities for 23 and 24, and then, I'm sorry, 4 facilities and then 5 facilities for 25 and outer.
What I'm saying is, I recall that we discussed what to do with the income last budgeting session. And so going forward with the increased amounts, have we decided where that money's going to be allocated, or is that going to be a decision?
There is nothing in the forecast for expenditures related to that specifically, but that's absolutely, yeah, a decision point that can be made and included in the budget document as a starting point.
The licensing, that takeout, is that a takeout fee to the restaurant for having takeout, or, what does that mean?
I would have to ask the city clerk about their designation.
Okay. I'm curious because of the issues that we've been having with the people that park wherever to pick up food for other people. And I'm curious if there's any connection that can be made to the licensing fee. Why is there an increase for the court-collected parking fees? Is that, is that based on an assumption that we'll hand out more tickets, or we'll raise the prices, or?
It's a wish and a hope that revenue kind of comes back. It's not based on any intended rate increase or different approach. It was just, hoping that those revenue collections kind of come back from where they were. Flat would probably be the more conservative route.
Thank you. And the DDA piece that you talked about,
Yep.
is that something we're talking about in 2023? Like, will we know this year what the decision was made on that?
Yep, I think the discussions are kind of happening concurrently. I think they had a meeting at the end of January. I think they're ongoing. These are just assuming that everything equals each other, and if not, they can kind of lift out together, the revenue and the expense.
Thank you. And my final 2 questions, that cell tower lease income, does that have any relation to the cell tower or the tower problem that our community is trying to get through right now?
I don't believe so. I think that it's,
Yeah, this is not related.
Yeah.
And will you tell me what's the difference? I just hear towers.
So I believe that, and Ms. McPherson can tell us more about where the towers are located, but that revenue line item references locations in the city where we've allowed cell tower placement, and we have a revenue contract from the cell tower providers. I think most of them are on water towers.
All right. And then my last question is, when I look at page 17 and 18, and I see total revenues, I am confused about why the sidewalks, the CDBG, is listed 2 places. And that's for the total revenue, sorry, I'm in page 18 and 19. So it's listed for revenues, and then it's also listed again for expenditures.
yep, exactly. So we would only do projects that that funds are available for. So if we didn't have CDBG funds allocated for sidewalks, we would not have the expense. So it's again, if it's there, both stay in. If it's not, both come out.
Thank you.
All right, so let's switch to expenditures. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about personnel expenditures because it makes up about 75% of the total expenditures of the general fund. So I want to kind of give you some trend information that you'll kind of notice for all the different categories that you'll see from one column to the next. 23 budgets compared to 22 actual is always going to be higher because, one, we've assumed a 3% COLA for 23, which went into effect on July 1st. We assume that we're going to be fully staffed for the whole budget year, and then we've also assumed that any vacant positions have been filled and that they've got full family benefits. So we know that 23's end of the year, we weren't fully staffed and might have had different staffing levels. 23 expectations are likely, in most circumstances, going to be less than our budget because of the kind of the inverse of those things. We know that we have vacancies, and we've had vacancies in some key positions for large portions of the year. So the one exception to that kind of trend for 23 is in the very top line of salaries and wage categories. So while we do have savings from those vacancies, because many of these were unplanned retirements or resignations of long-term employees, those result in these large leave payouts that sort of somewhat, and in most cases, offset those savings completely. So that's why wages are increasing beyond the budget number. And then all the other components of personnel services are likely declining from our budget expectation, our budget assumptions. So looking specifically at salaries and wages, so we have a module in our accounting software that uses our actual payroll costs, and based on actual employees' wages and benefits, we can extrapolate those positions out with a COLA, and then any new positions that are being requested and approved, we've included those. We've planned for any scheduled step increases, that if employees are still in their wage band, they have steps available, and then we've included any planned retirements or that we know of. We do continue to try and refine these positions between now and the budget, but if those positions didn't change, these numbers would stay pretty much the same because these are already based on what our 24 numbers are thinking. So what position changes are we including? So we've already incorporated several new positions that are listed here on the left that we've included in the forecast. And I would say for the part-time or part-time to full-time changes, that's an additional like $30,000 to $40,000 per position. And then for any of the full-time positions, that's an additional $100,000 to $120,000 per position that's already been included in these 24 forecast numbers. The under consideration are ones that are positions that have kind of come up as requests or potential items that are still in development, so they haven't been fully discussed and committed and put into the numbers. So if those come to fruition, we will include those numbers in the 24 budget document that you see. So I mentioned the COLA, and we are assuming a 3% COLA for fiscal year 24. And this is based on most of our contracts are settled. We have 2 contracts that are expiring in June. So those are still subject to negotiation, but for most contracts, they've already agreed to a 3% COLA, so that's what we've used for our forecast numbers. And I'm providing kind of a wage history here, just so you can kind of see the history of those COLAs. There was, that time after the recession where there was very minimal COLAs, just to kind of be a stopgap for that loss of revenue. I feel like we're starting to turn the corner a little bit. We're getting back to staffing levels where they need to be, and then we're having more consistent years of more than 0, 1, or 2% COLAs. That being said, just in outer years, because we don't have any contracts that have gone out any further than fiscal year 24, I'm just assuming a 2% COLA for each of those years, and then an additional 1% increase just to account for any staff that's still in steps. So,
Can I ask
sorry.
a question?
Yep.
Backing up to the position changes included in forecast.
Yep.
It's got the bullet points there. Fort Police reinstated school resource officer. That forecast isn't like in what year? Could that be immediate, or could that be next fiscal year? Or?
So anything that I have in that column, I think all of those, Majority of those are effective July, assuming July 1 start date. I want to say some of the police officers, we've reinstated some of maybe the jail and the PACE officers during this year. So we've had to, they weren't in the budget for 23, but they have to be included in the expectations and then in the 24. But anything that's listed there is assumed that it starts as of July 1 for the whole fiscal year 24 and outer years.
Thank you.
The fund balance accumulation and the use of it, I want to make sure I'm reading it properly. So it said in fiscal year 23 budget, it was anticipated to be about 2.6 million, and then the actual was about 875. Is that correct? And it's what is there? Where is that explained, or how is that explained, the difference between those two?
So I will talk about it as we kind of get all the way down there, but
Okay.
that specifically, our revenue expectations are a lot higher than our budget expectations were. So our expenses are almost what we expected and budgeted, but revenue's coming in a lot better. So that's where we're making up some ground. Okay, so then going back to the forecast, looking at our retirement. So the first retirement line item includes our defined benefit pension costs, our required contributions, but that also includes our hybrid contributions and our defined contribution plan contributions. So we have 3 different retirement plans, and they all are showing up in that particular line item. So our hybrid and our DC plans are all percentage based. So for outer years, they follow whatever the wage increase percentages are following. The defined benefit amount, which is the majority of that amount, we're using the numbers that are provided to us in our most recent valuation, which was from December 21. We won't get the 22 valuation until this summer. So that valuation gives us what our required contribution is going to be, so we know it right now what that number is going to be as of July 1st. And some of the assumption changes that are included in there, they've made some demographic assumption changes, and they've also reduced our investment rate to 7%. Fiscal year 25 is based on that valuation, also has a 5-year projection. We just used the first year for that projection. Outer years, there's too much that has changed between those valuations to really use them as outer years. So we just are using the fiscal year 25 number. And then we're assuming that there's no assumption changes in outer years. So we're thinking that the supplemental pension payments are gonna assist in keeping that required contribution flat in those outer years. And like I said, we're assuming no assumption changes, but MERS does experience studies about every 5 years, so that typically results in an impact to our assumptions and our valuation. So then, speaking of the supplemental DB, that's our separate line item there. And so 23 is including an additional supplemental pension payment of $2 million that we added beyond what was originally budgeted. We used some savings from fiscal year 22 to put that towards the DB plan, and we've already made we've made all of the contributions from the general fund that we've budgeted at this point. So for future years, we're continuing to use the assumption that we want to make a $5 million supplemental pension payment between the income tax fund and the general fund. So what you're seeing in the outer years from the general fund is that it's starting to go down and then it's going away completely. So in about fiscal year 26, we're assuming that the income tax fund alone can make more than a $5 million supplemental pension payment. So that's relieving some stress on the general fund if we want to continue making $5 million payments. In our most recent valuation, MERS did include a recommendation of how we can reach 100% funding in 10 years, and that was by contributing $3 million in excess of our required contributions. So in 10 years, the income tax will be expired, so we won't quite make it to that 10 years, but if we're contributing $5 million up through the end of that income tax, I feel like that keeps us right on target. So,
Is that
yep.
expired if not renewed?
If not renewed, yes. Yep. So I always like to kind of show our supplemental pension payments. This is this graph that we like to keep up to date since we've been making a concerted effort to make these supplemental pension payments. So over these last 8 years, we've made almost $33 million in supplemental payments, and almost half of that is coming directly from the income tax. So it has, as I said, the income tax has been instrumental in improving the city's finances. That being said, if we go to the next slide, this is showing our pension funding progress. And it's hard to tell, but our funding progress is improving, and those lines are getting closer together. So that bottom line is our net positions or assets of our pension, and then the top line is our pension liability. So while it's hard to tell, they are getting closer together, and because we're making those supplemental pension payments and we're committed to making those payments, we are improving our funding progress year over year.
Can I ask a really just absolutely idiotic question?
Please do.
So the net position versus the percent funded, I guess I don't understand why the percent funded isn't the net position.
So net position in more of a accounting term really is the assets of
Okay.
because it's not in a trust like OPEB. On OPEB, I have a easier terminology because it's easier to say, here's the dollars in our trust.
Okay.
It's not really dollars in our trust. It's the value of the funds we have contributed at MERS.
Okay.
So,
So-
the net of lots of other things.
So the percent funded is really kind of just a reference
A
on
reference,
this chart?
yes.
Okay, got it.
Correct.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not an accountant. I'm sure you're really shocked to hear that. Yeah.
And yeah, the terminology is not
Got it.
easily understood by
Okay.
anyone.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep. So then I want to kind of compare this funding progress to our OPEB funding progress while I talk through our OPEB items. So retiree health care, so OPEB, when we talk about OPEB, are other post-employment benefits, or it's our retiree health care. So we have an annual pay-as-you-go piece. So we call it pay-as-you-go because we are not accessing the assets of our trust. We are paying our premiums and our costs of retiree health care directly from the general fund. So we're expecting that those premium rates are going to hold somewhat steady for retirees, but we do allow some increases in the forecast based on, we have a separate OPEB valuation and based on industry-related healthcare trends for those outer years, but we have been typically seeing better results in industry trends. So we are seeing some savings in '23 because we got a flat renewal from Humana. That's on a calendar year basis. So we were expecting about a 3.5% increase on our over 65 costs, but because we got a flat renewal, we're going to see some savings on the last half of the year this year. And then in fiscal year '24, you're seeing a little bit of a decline because we're starting to factor in additional contributions from the retirees. So for quite some time, retirees paid nothing or very little when they retired, but as current employees are starting to have to pay more when they retire, they will continue to have to pay those payments. So the value of those contributions is growing, so the general fund and the departments won't have to pay quite as much as retirees start to contribute a little bit of their co-share as they retire. So looking at supplemental retiree health care, so this is pre-funding of our OPEB plan. And so under P 202, we're required to contribute the normal cost for employees hired after June 30th, 2018 that have promise of retiree health care. So this specifically relates to our police and fire employees that receive health care and retirement up to Medicare age. So the normal cost in fiscal year '22 was in total $32,000 to cover 26 employees. So that was the normal cost that we actually had based on our valuation, and we're comparing that to the $100,000 that we have budgeted for these forecasts. So each year we look at our valuation and the results of that to make sure that we're still on trend, and by continuing to contribute the $100,000, we're well covered on our normal cost. And we need to continue to commit to that pre-funding, and we continue to review each year to make sure that we're covered. So kind of going back to the funding progress, We have approximately $20.9 million in our trust that we're not accessing for any, we're just letting it sit there and letting it grow. And then it's compared to our OPEB liability of $36.9 million. So the numbers are very different when you're comparing OPEB to pension. We're talking about $200 million compared to $40 million. So we have had really good improvement on our funding progress as we've had these supplemental contributions, and the assumption changes that we've had in our evaluations have actually had a positive impact on our liability rather than a negative impact. So those numbers are coming together much more quickly. However, I will say that because we have these assets in the trust, it is very volatile with reactions to the market. So that's why I kind of wanted to show a history here. That's why we want to leave them in the trust and not touch them until we absolutely have to, until we're more fully funded and can leave those balances to cover our premiums. If we can pay it as we go, we might as well.
Quick question. Based on the model and kind of when people would access the OPEB funding, wouldn't this be considered fully funded? If I'm saying kind of the trust is seeded, would we ever have a point where we're accessing the entire 40 million?
Yeah, I think as these lines cross over, there is a point where we should start using the funds of the trust to pay, but not until we're fully funded. And I would kind of defer to MERS and an actuary to tell us, to make sure like that there isn't a point that we're going to run out of money. But yes, theoretically, there is a crossover point where we should start using those funds.
Is the same true when you look at the pension progress, fund progress, and I'm noticing that the trend line is up, obviously, through 22, but when the hybrid plans and the DC plans take full effect, will that line then be trending downward? And how far out is that, or do we have some type of estimate on when that begins to look different?
I can't speak to that at this point. I certainly can talk to our actuaries. We still have police and fire that are in DB plans, so until that plan changes, there's always going to be a required contribution for DB plans. And until our retirees start dying, pass on, that liability is going to continue, and people are living longer. And people are living longer, and that is why MERS has changed our demographic assumptions, because people are living longer, so our liability is going up.
With police and fire, are they in full DB, or the
Yes.
new hires are hybrid plans?
Nope, new hires are full DB.
Full DB. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then back to our expenditure spreadsheet. So then health insurance for our active employees. So we use an insurance fund at the city, meaning that we kind of create our own internal premiums to cover what we think the cost of our actual premiums are going to be, what our administrative costs are going to be, and then we're insured for some of our, self-insured for some of our plans. So these manual premiums are intended to cover the expected costs. The last few years, the insurance fund had been performing better than we were expecting, so we had this accumulated reserve. So in fiscal year 22, we chose to reduce this internal rate by about 10%. So that's the rate that we're charging to our departments for their share of health insurance. So we were able to use up some of our reserves over the last 2 years with that 10% reduction, but we feel like at this point we've used as much reserve as we can, and we need to bring those rates back up to that fiscal year 22 rate to make sure that we're staying in line with our healthcare costs as they come in. So that's accounting for about 11% of our increase to our current active costs. And then the other large variance from our 23 expectation to the 24 forecast is that we've had several long-term vacancies. So 23, we've had reduced expenses and savings, but we're assuming that any filled position, any vacant position is filled in 24, and we have to assume that they have a family plan, because just to be conservative, that we assume that they have a family plan, because we don't know who's going to fill that position when they come in. And there's quite a difference in cost between a family plan, single, double, or a med buyout. So then for outer years, the city has limited exposure to increases because we use the state hard cap and that limits the cost that employers can bear for health insurance. So these hard cap limits have increased anywhere between 1.9 and 3.7%. So that means that any increases beyond that from our premium, from our carriers, beyond that hard cap, the employees would have to bear the cost of that rather than the city. So we've had flat increases. So in the last year, so employees have not had to pay more, but we've had we've done many things through education and restructuring the plan to make sure that those rates haven't gone up, but we're experiencing a little bit higher of usage. So I would definitely expect our premium rates to increase for this next renewal. The healthcare task force is starting their meetings to come up with those and review those, and that usually happens during the spring sometime. So we won't know the results of that until later in the year. And then finally, under personnel services, we have other fringes. So that includes our taxes for Social Security, life insurance, dental insurance, and workers' comp. So because a lot of those are percentage-based, a lot of those will follow those same fluctuations with vacancies or filling the positions. One thing to note is our workers' comp rates have been increasing year over year for public safety and public works categories. It's a very small percentage, so those large increases don't have a huge impact on the total cost, but it's just something that we've noticed year over year. And then in fiscal year 24, we've also included a $5 increase or a 10% increase to our employee parking permits, and that's the rate that the parking fund charges City Hall employees for parking in our lots, because we can't sell those to residents because we're providing those rates or those spots to our employees. All right, I'll pause at personnel expenditures before I move on to the rest. Any other questions about personnel?
Do you all have paid sick leave or paid annual leave, or how, is there a breakdown?
So depending on the union, you could have PTO, personal time off, or you would have sick, vacation. Some unions have long-term sick, personal leave. It runs the gamut depending on the union.
And where does that fall, or does it fall somewhere?
It would fall under salaries and wages. So we would assume that, so if you use time, you're still getting paid your normal wage. So your full wage is your full wage. We do have annual time payouts for non-union employees, and that amount would also be included under salaries and wages.
Okay. Is there a way I could see sometime later what it would look like if there was parental leave, like 4 weeks paid?
I think we could come up with that figure. Any other questions? All right. So then operating expenses, and I would say, again, look at that kind of last page of the document, because operating expenses includes a lot of different line items, such as contract services, utilities, repairs and maintenance, garage fees, and then any other operating costs you can think of. So everything except for personnel, capital outlay, and transfers. So the trend that we're seeing here is that operations are somewhat returning to pre-COVID levels, which is a positive, obviously, that we're operating at a larger capacity. For most of the different categories, we're assuming a CPI increase in those outer years. One item that's growing faster than others is our contract services expense, and particularly in fiscal year 24, the fire department has taken on a couple of new large contracts, specifically for equipment maintenance, and then they have a new policy manual development a contract that I think would only be for a couple of years, but I heard rumblings that other departments are possibly going to go down the same route to develop these policy manuals. Then next is our net indirect charges, and so this line item is the net impact to the general fund for all of our governmental services that are used to support other funds. So finance, HR, communications, and government buildings. We provide services to all departments of the city, so we charge those out kind of to parking or water and sewer, because we provide services to not just the general fund. So to come up with this number, we did an indirect cost study several years ago. We did one major update in 2018. We were intending to do one in the fall of 21 using fiscal year 21 figures, but we didn't really feel like that was operationally representative or financially representative of the transactions for the city. Because of COVID, we were still kind of in the midst of that. So we were planning on to do an update in fall of 23 with fiscal year 23 results, because we feel like that's a more quote unquote normal year to base these charges on. We've just kind of used these rates and use the CPI factor for the outer years, but we'll revise them after we go through this rate study. The next category is our sidewalk program, and so this is made up of a couple different things. So the amount in fiscal year 22 is extremely small, because both the hazardous sidewalk and the CDBG projects got pushed until fiscal year 23. So there's kind of carryover from last year to this year. Included in those numbers is an assumption for $100,000 of spending based on CDBG available funding, as we talked about earlier. And then for fiscal years 23 through 25, we're assuming $500,000 cost for the hazardous sidewalk project through ARPA funding, if available. And then after that time, we're assuming only $50,000 for just miscellaneous repairs. So if we can't do the hazardous program, we would just do kind of stopgap for miscellaneous sidewalk projects. And then capital outlay. So fiscal year 22, this is where we have that $120,000 that I mentioned for the lease accounting, that one-time item to record the leases. And then, so then all outer years from there really assume just a very small amount of money for general fund to share in any capital outlay needs. What's not included in here is any assumption of ARPA costs or income tax dollars being used for deferred maintenance, because those would probably be housed in our CIP fund if we were going to use those dollars for those projects. So rather than being in the general fund, we'd probably dedicate those funds in a different fund. Moving on to transfers. So the Parks and Rec Fund had been greatly impacted by COVID and had been requiring significant additional transfers in the last couple of years. But now that their operations are kind of returning to normal and they've found some other grant funds available, the general fund subsidy, we've sort of returned it to where it would have been factoring in CPI without those additional contributions. So starting in fiscal year 23 and out, we're just assuming CPI increases to the Parks and Rec Fund. Capital Improvements Fund. So this had a very large transfer at the end of last year. So we've chosen to move the sale proceeds from Lot 4, which was like $807,000. We've chosen to move those funds out of the general fund and put them in our facility improvement fund for some additional or some future project, which we have not designated yet. And then 22 also included $150,000 for some ongoing HANA projects that needed additional funding in 22. So for fiscal year 23 and all outer years, we are just assuming that we will transfer funds for our Avondale debt subsidy. There's some increase to TIF captures that goes to fund that debt payment, but the general fund has to kind of make up the difference on wherever the principal payments are as they fluctuate, principal and interest payments. The general fund has to kind of make up that difference. So those fluctuate in those outer years. And finally, in going to the capital improvement fund, as I mentioned, if we were to send money or spend money on facility repairs, it would probably be in that fund, and rather than transferring any general fund dollars, we've sort of, as I said, transferred that sale proceeds, and we have ARPA and income tax dollars that would go to those funds So we wouldn't see those transfers in outer years. All other transfers includes the seniors program, debt service, art festival, and public art funds. And most of those are flat or CPI, with the exception being debt service. We have to transfer whatever we need to make up the principal amounts for our 2016 refunder, and those principal amounts are decreasing in outer years. So like revenue, we have a line in green that shows our expenditure growth that we're assuming or expecting for all those years. 2023's increase is significant. Obviously, if you compare that percentage to 22 or in outer years, it's much different. But that's really as a result of that $2 million pension payment. That's a big swing in 1 year that we added rather than, and then as those supplemental pension payments taper off and operations kick back into full gear, those fluctuations kind of change depending on the makeup of the expenses that we talked about. So I'll pause there. Any questions on expenditures?
So the ARPA funds don't make it into the general fund, or they travel through the general fund before they end up in their ultimate destination?
It depends.
Okay.
So for, let's use hazard pay as an example. We have hazard pay and it hits all the different funds. So we would just, right now it's sitting as unearned revenue. So we haven't done anything to designate its purpose, and it's just sitting as on the balance sheet in the general fund. So as we have expenses, we record the revenue and the expense in whatever fund it sort of belongs to. So sidewalk projects and the drain projects are intended to be in the general fund, but if we have infrastructure improvements, we'd probably run those through the capital improvements fund.
Got it. So some of it does, but not all of it,
Correct.
depending on where it ultimately ends
Yeah.
up. Got it.
And we have about 6 million still yet to designate, so more could come to the general fund or less depending on where those, yeah.
Great, thanks.
So then below that expected expenditure growth, we have the yellow line that's our accumulation or use of fund balance. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, this is the most positive forecast because in all those outer years, we're not even using fund balance. The 23 expectation, we are still planning to use fund balance less than we were originally intending. Like I said, as Randy had asked, our revenue expenditure, oh boy, it's been how long now? Our revenue expectations are coming in much better than we had originally thought, so that's why we're going to have less spending than we thought. And then all those outer years, I think, again, revenue is coming better. Our transfer from our income tax improves both with the property tax reimbursement and with the growth for our public safety. And then with the offset being that we have less supplemental pension payments, so our revenues are increasing and our expenses are going down. So it's only having positive impacts in those outer years.
Quick question.
Yep.
You mentioned the kind of enhancements to capturing on the income tax
Yes.
side. Are we handling that internally, or have we got an external method for how we're capturing that kind of missed revenue there?
Most of it is through our in-house. I mean, we use an income tax service that kind of helps us get the data. What I was specifically referencing is we get the state tapes. So it's information from the state of Michigan on the 2019 tax returns in this example, and we follow up on that information.
So you just cross-reference and then go, who didn't pay?
Correct.
Good, okay.
So just so I make sure I'm understanding the budget and budget process, that's, I recall that council had a policy of trying to maintain a fund balance
Yep.
of like 12 to 15% of what number?
So that was recently revised to 10 to 20% available fund balance compared to operating expenditures.
To operating
You keep
expenses.
asking questions that I'm going to get to.
Oh, okay. If you're going there, that's fine. I thought you
I
were at the
definitely,
last
yeah.
page.
I'm
Okay.
definitely getting there.
Okay.
I
All right.
promise.
Thank you.
So after net revenue and expenditures, we have our total fund balance at the end of each year in purple under expenditures. There's items that we've designated for a specific purpose that you would want to back out of that available number to come up, back out of your total number to come up with what's available fund balance. And so specifically what I have listed here, the first item, last year, the 2.3 million was 2 million for pension payments, which we've made, supplemental pension payments, which we've made, and then $300,000 for Chesterfield rental conversion project. Currently, we haven't made any action on that, so when we start with that project, we will use those funds and they will become unassigned and go back to our available fund balance. I'm going to skip over the next one for a second. The bottom non-spendable number is land available for sale. So our Dietrich property, it is the value of that land, but it is non-spendable because it is a tangible piece of property. It's not cash in our bank account. So once we sell that property, then that will become part of our available fund balance. But currently it is reducing our available fund balance because we can't use land. So then I'm going to back up to that BWL number. So as I said, we don't know what's going on necessarily with this this source of revenue, and we want to be conservative. And I kind of wanted to designate this item because it has been a positive source of revenue for the general fund to really provide a stopgap before we had the income tax, and it still is an important source of revenue for the city. So what I wanted to show, starting in fiscal year 23, that's the current expectation of what we're going to get for 23, and then in all future years, I've said what is the current collection plus what is the prior to that date, the collections to that date. And you can see how that number obviously grows in those outer years. If for some reason that revenue source were to go away, where would our available revenue fund balance be in those outer years? And you can see that it has a dramatic impact in that fifth year out. What this does not show us is what we've collected previously. So we started collecting this franchise fee in 2017, and we've collected close to $7 million prior to fiscal year 23. So if we have unfavorable results to this litigation, and perhaps those funds have to be repaid, you can see in fiscal year 23, we don't have $7 million available fund balance. So I just want to put that caution out there, put that information out there. If a new revenue source needs to be found, it would be important to do so because it is a significant impact to the general fund. So on that positive note, I'll switch to operating indicators. So on those bottom two numbers, those are kind of common indicators that we've always used to identify where we are at with our available fund balance. So first we have available fund balance as a percentage of operating expenditures. And as Randy mentioned, we have a council policy that was recently revised to change to 10 to 20%. And so you can see, and that's, and you can see in that fifth year out, we're still between those percentages. So we're doing okay on that council policy. To put it in a different context, I also wanted to include the months of operation. So how many months could we operate without $1 of revenue? And GFOA, the governmental finance officers' best practice is to maintain at least 2 months of operating expenditures. So you can see that we're not really at 2 months of operating expenditures. I believe our council policy is also based on GFOA best practice, so they kind of contradict each other a little bit. But I just thought that those kind of provided a little more context. So then I'm just going to put up a last slide about the overall picture of the forecast. I just kind of want to leave this up here as I answer any other questions. This is showing our revenues in blue compared to our expenses in red, and then that yellow use or add to fund balance. So I'll just leave this up and answer any questions.
Questions?
I did have a question about the budget timeline, but I can wait.
I will, okay, yeah, we can move right on to that. So that's kind of the last piece of business that I wanted to get to, is this is kind of our budget timeline. I basically took last year's and rolled it over to current dates. I'm happy to make any tweaks to this, anything that we want to add, anything that we want to change. The only thing that I would like to mention is we do need to fit in here a discussion about the capital improvement plan that's still to come. So we have to fit that into the schedule. And then I do know that police would probably normally go on that first general fund night, but Chief is going to be out of town, so we'd have to save him to the second general fund night, if that's what we still wanted to do. So I will take any recommendations or any other thoughts that you have.
For the chief's piece, can we add police budget or public safety into the items, just like general fund is there?
Yep. And I have to refresh myself what general fund pieces. I'm assuming we had fire talk, police talk. I'm sure Jill went over general fund revenues. But if there's anything else specifically, I can again refresh myself from last year. But we'll I think that was definitely on the docket. Yep.
Do you think Tom Fehrenbach's piece was parks capital improvement? Was that what he would talk about, or?
I would say that he probably talked more in the general fund, and then the CDBG and capital improve. Oh yeah, so he would be on like the April 18th section. Parks capital improvement is specifically more like the trails and bridges capital improvement. The earlier night is more the facilities and those kind of improvements.
Okay.
So I think we've got it scheduled for both.
Okay.
All right, any more questions?
Yep. And I'm happy to take any recommendations as so as you can see, the next month and a half is going to be discussions on all those different funds and all those different budgets. And if there's anything that you are hoping to see or want to see that maybe you hadn't seen in the past, absolutely, let's have those conversations.
Two questions. I think one question and a remark. Did anybody take notes on my questions? Sometimes I've asked questions and then they just kind of like fall off. And so I took some notes on my questions, but did anybody take some notes?
We'll typically kind of go back and review, but if there are specific questions that you've fully formulated and you want to send us, absolutely, because sometimes we have to kind of decipher what the conversation was as it was happening. So if you have a fully formed question, absolutely send it to us and we will get you a response.
Yeah, it's just those same questions that I
Okay,
asked.
yep.
Okay, yeah. But I've written them down too, so I
Okay.
will send those to you all. And I was curious about the change in job responsibilities since you don't have a finance director. What's that been like for you?
Tough. It's been tough. Justin has been like my right-hand person. I wouldn't be able to do this without him. It's been really tough.
Well, thank you for being here. This was important, and I understood everything, so I appreciate you putting in the work, and hopefully we can get things worked out so it's not too stressful much longer, or we can figure out a different plan to support you all, and thank you for being here too.
Absolutely.
Do have follow-up, and I'm part of his comment, and then also just to, again, get some information. One thing I observed when I was working as a department head is there's often a sentiment that some of the problems were a result of mismanagement or lack of effort in addressing pension and other things. And I know there were a lot of changes in all of those things to reduce the costs and try to assist in those things. But I just want to highlight, it was a question earlier about Public Act 289, for example, and the fact that during the Engler years that was slashed almost entirely.
Yeah.
And that was money that would have been or could have been directly contributed to pension costs. And the point of Public Act 289 was to offset lost revenue from tax income that's not received from state buildings. And so to take that money and slash it, I think this community is still paying a price for that. And I think while certainly grateful, I think it was Governor Whitmer that restored that to have it fully funded. I still get a sense that that is excellent. That was necessary and that was needed, but you still had years of lost revenue that have seriously impacted this community. And I don't know where I got this number, I hope I didn't just dream it or make it up, but somewhere, I saw that state buildings represent like 45% of the property value or the properties in the city of East Lansing. And so when you look at that lost revenue out of 45% of your properties, and I don't know how that was, where that number came from, if you're talking about square feet or if you're talking about some other way of deriving that number, and then losing all of that taxable value, and then on top of that, losing the money that was supposed to be allocated for that through the state budget process, it's put an unfair burden on the residents, and we understand the frustration with that, but I think that there's a lot more to the story than neglect or mismanagement or inattention to those issues, and it's part of the reason I've asked the question about the pension costs changing and that trend line changing, because I know there were a lot of adjustments made, and hopefully we'll see the results of that, but I still think it's worth lobbying about some one-time costs to come back and make up for all of those years that we couldn't contribute to pension costs because of the loss entirely at one point of 289 money. That was a big hit to this community. I just want to kind of go on the record of saying that, and just I think it would be a tremendous disservice if we were confronted with that again. I don't know, and this maybe was directed toward David, but if there's a way, I was trying to, in my own kind of sophomoric way, look at cities of population size of about 50,000 and compare their property tax revenue to the city of East Lansing. But I know there's a lot that goes into that in terms of property values. But I would be interested to see what the difference was when you have a population that size, and it might be also dependent on the number of structures. But what the difference is in revenue that's generated versus when you lose all that value for state buildings. I don't know how to get at that number, but it would be something I would at least be interested in seeing how we've been impacted by that.
Any more questions? All right, thank you, guys.
And thanks to you and your staff. I know it's a difficult time. Thank you.
All right, next up, the consent agenda.
Thank you.
Hold on, I've been asked for a break.
Andy's just like limpering up.
You want 5 minutes, okay? Yeah. 5 minute. Can we do a 5 minute break right here? Welcome back. Next up, the consent agenda.
Thank you, Mayor. Item 4.1, approve the following appointments or reappointments to boards or commissions. Joshua Hewitt to the Human Rights Commission for a full term ending December 31st, 2025. Kayla Gomez to the Human Rights Commission for a full term ending December 31st, 2025. Tina Farhat to the Human Rights Commission for a full term ending December 31st, 2025. Item 4.2, approve a letter supporting the Capital Region International Airport and American Airlines request for extension of the exemption authorizing nonstop daily service between Lansing and Washington, D.C., and authorize the mayor to sign on behalf of the City Council. Item 4.3, approve the closure of 2 lanes on Albert Avenue between MAC Avenue and Abbott Road, beginning no sooner than May 1st, 2023, and ending no later than September 17th, 2023, for Albert L. Fresco. Item 4.4, set a public hearing for the March 7th, 2023 City Council regular meeting to consider a cluster development and site plan application from FP Investors, LLC, to construct 4 3-unit dwellings at the Falcon Point development located on the south side of State Road, west of Chandler Road. Item 4.5, set a public hearing for the March 7th, 2023 City Council regular meeting to consider a site plan application from the Gentilisa Real Estate to construct a 23,000 square foot industrial building at 3400 West Road. Item 4.6, approve a contract change with Levitt and Stark Excavating Incorporated for the fiscal year 22 hazardous sidewalk program, Chesterfield neighborhood, in the amount of $58,526.36, and authorize the city manager to sign. Item 4.7, approve a contract change order with Tetra Tech in the amount of $29,300 to prepare a 5-year drinking water state revolving fund project plan for multiple projects, and authorize the city manager to sign. Item 4.8, approve the renewal of a joint funding agreement with the United States Geological Survey for the maintenance and operation of 2-stream gages on the Red Cedar River. Item 4.9, approve a 2-year renewal agreement for subscription to DebtBook platform assistance with GASB 96 implementation, and authorize the city manager to sign. Item 4.10, approve a conditional Class 3 rental license for 630 Lexington Avenue, allowing up to 2 unrelated persons or a family to occupy the property. The owner is Noah Thompson, who currently resides at the property. A mailing address for his family is provided in Ann Arbor on the application. And these are our consent agenda items.
I'll look for a motion.
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
Any discussion? I'll have a point of discussion on item, where are we at here? It's more just as a reminder, item 4.3, and I'd already talked to Matt about this request from hospitality to have a conversation with public safety as we move forward on this, and Matt will send out the proper memorandum to everyone, whoever should be in there, police and fire, and all that, just to kind of discuss the pre-work going into road closure and that kind of thing, and public safety piece. So, are we good? Okay. Seeing that. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Consent agenda passes. Next up, on to the business agenda, item 5.1, consideration of guidelines for poverty exemption review and policy resolution 2023-2.
Good evening again. Yeah, so there is, under Michigan law, it's possible for somebody who is in poverty to apply for an exemption from property taxes and get an exemption. The law that governs that exemption requires that the city's governing body establish guidelines for use in administering that exemption. The guidelines including income level tests and asset level tests. So essentially, if somebody applies and their income is above a certain amount, they're not eligible. If it's below a certain amount, they are eligible. And likewise, if they have assets that are above a certain amount, they're not eligible. If they have assets below a certain amount, as specified by council, they would be eligible for the exemption. They have to meet both those tests. So it used to be that there are guidelines that are currently in place. It used to be that the Board of Review who grants these exemptions, they could deviate from the guidelines that are established by council with compelling reasons. The law has changed, and that is no longer the case. So the Board of Review has to adhere strictly to the guidelines that are provided by council. And so the first part of what's before you tonight is kind of a housekeeping matter where the guidelines, the language in the guidelines and the policy resolution is changed so that it matches what the current statute is, as I've just described, in terms of the Board of Review cannot deviate from the guidelines. And as we're bringing this to you, it seemed that we should also be considering the level of the income test that is used in determining the exemption. So up until now, the city has used the federal poverty guidelines for the income level, as part of the income level test in the city's poverty exemption guidelines. The federal poverty guidelines are pretty low. So it's certainly possible for somebody to be in a situation of true need and have income above those guidelines. So what's before you tonight, we're recommending that that the council adopt new guidelines, and as they adopt the new guidelines, that they loosen those income requirements somewhat so that people who are in true need can get the poverty exemption. Specifically, what we're proposing is that a tiered asset level test be used, whereby if an applicant has household income of 100% or less of the federal poverty guidelines, they would receive a full poverty exemption. If they have income level test between 100 and 125% of the federal guidelines, they would get a 50% exemption. And if they have asset and income between 125% and 135% of the federal poverty guidelines, they would be entitled to a 25% exemption. So it step down the exemption and phase it out as the income level increases. So with that, if there are any questions, I'd be glad to address them.
Quick question. As far as that's, would we apply our own inflation metric in there on top of that, or would it be based on that metric from the federal government?
So the federal guidelines are adopted annually. They change annually. And so we would just take those guidelines and then apply 100%, 125, 100% to get those numbers. I think in the agenda packet there were charts showing what the tiered asset income levels would be. And those would change. Usually they go up a little bit each year based on what the federal numbers are, if that answered your question.
Yeah, it did.
Okay.
And then second, so there's not even a possibility of like a catastrophic exemption, say someone has a change to their family structure.
That's the way it used to work, and it does not work that way anymore.
So that's gone.
Yep.
Okay.
The language of the statute just eliminated that.
Yeah, like a catastrophic loss of a spouse or something,
Loss of income or
a hold that changes your.
I suppose that would work for the next cycle.
Yeah.
But yeah, it wouldn't, because you look at what the income has been as they determine the exemptions.
Okay.
And is that based on their filed tax form from the previous year? Is
Yes.
that part?
So,
Okay.
yes. So we request, and they provide to us their income tax returns, their most recent income tax returns, homestead property tax credit returns. If somebody is not required to file a income tax return, then they file an affidavit with us to that effect. So it gets pretty detailed, the analysis
Yeah.
the scrutiny that gets put into these.
And then it has to go to the Board of Review even after they've provided all of those documents, or it's an automatic approval if they meet the requirements?
So they apply. The application is, we review it, make a recommendation, and the Board of Review is the final determinant of, they make the decision.
Okay.
Right? I guess.
Would you say historically they've kind of approved it if it meets the guidelines?
Yes, there have been situations where they were close to the guidelines, like just above the federal guidelines, and they determined compelling reasons that they would still get an exemption.
But now with the current new guidelines, that would not be
They
moved
cannot, it wouldn't be
forward.
lawful for them to do that
Okay.
any longer, right?
Okay. I'm always just a little bit worried when we have things that are this personal and sensitive that go up against, I mean, I think extremely highly of our commissions, but they are also staffed by volunteers, and it is a heavy burden on them to, make these kind of life and death decisions. So I would hope that this smoothed the path, I guess, and made it easier for them to just kind of approve these as they come through.
That's the idea, is
Okay.
it'll loosen the requirements and allow more people to get them. We're also not talking about a ton of people who apply for these each year. Generally,
Right.
there's 2 to 4
Okay.
per year. This last year, there was 1 applicant, and their income was way above. And they did not
So
get
it's
the
a
exemption.
Hail Mary, as it were, that
Yeah.
probably didn't pay out. Okay, got it.
Right.
So does the person need to know that they qualify, or do we let them know that they might qualify?
So we put the exemption, the guidelines on, we make that available on our website, and that includes the income and asset level tests that are used. So if somebody, generally, I think they should have an idea when they're applying whether or not they're eligible, yes.
Say again?
I think generally if an applicant would have a good idea, or should have a good idea, whether or not they are eligible as they apply.
Would you say because they found it on our website, or because someone told them?
Both through the process. As they're applying, we're definitely going to be in communication with them, but on top of that, the information it's pretty clear on the website.
Yeah, my point is just, it'd be too bad for people to miss out if they do qualify, because no one's mentioned it to them before. That's just my point. So again, you're increasing the income requirement, which is good, but the guidelines hasn't changed. Like, you haven't added anything extra to how they become qualified.
No, they simply make application with us using a state form and provide copies of their bank statements, their income tax returns, and so forth. That process has not changed.
Thanks.
I'll move the motion. I'll move approval of the guidelines for poverty exemption review and policy resolution 2023-2 as presented.
Second.
Any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Meeting adjourned.